The next chapter in U.S. history off with a bang. The crowd at the Biden election headquarters going wild as Joe Biden and Kamala Harris took the stage.
It is now my great honor to introduce the President-elect of the United States of America, Joe Biden.
Addressing Americans for the first time as winners after a contentious battle for the White House with nail-biting numbers in a 5-day counting process. Biden calling for unity in this divided nation that has been facing civil unrest and a relentless pandemic for much of 2020.
I pledge to be a president who seeks not to divide, but unify. Who doesn't see red states and blue states, only sees the United States. The Bible tells us, to everything there is a season, a time to build, a time to reap and a time to sow, and a time to heal. This is the time to heal in America.
Their acceptance speech came after a day of celebrations in several cities across the country. President Trump was golfing as the news came in earlier, on Twitter falsely saying he actually won the election, pushing the baseless claim that observers were not allowed to watch ballot counters. Trump's legal team vowing to challenge the election results.
Modernity has its challenges. We have advanced to the point where we can anticipate an outcome before the outcome is actually finalized. That's where we are. We know that states have not yet officially certified their vote totals, but based on what we've seen in terms of the numbers that have been reported, we now know who has won the race for the White House. Unfortunately, the current occupant of the White House is in a deep sense of denial. I heard earlier it said, and I believe it to be true, that he's in the early phases of grief. One of the early signs of grieving is shock and then denial. This denial runs deep, and this denial will probably run for several days, waiting for the inevitable to finally confront him. We know that this has been an administration devoid of information. Accuracy is not part of its DNA. And so for the rest of us, we have to go forward as if there's a plan that must be in place. There is a new administration that will assume leadership on January 20th. And so the rest of us in the meantime need to be really clear and focused on what are the issues that really matter. This election was not just about personality, it was about policy. And so what are the policy concerns? What are the policy priorities that affect communities, whether they're rural or urban, whether they're white or Black, Asian, Hispanic? What are the concerns that have gone largely ignored or even harmed over the last 4 years that now need to be remedied? And so this conversation is key. A key part of that will be part of this discussion is a runoff election that is now set for January the 5th in Georgia. There are some timelines that we need to be aware of. There are some outcomes. This is really our learning mode for the new civics, right? We've been deprived of civic engagement by an administration that does not do civic engagement and has been enabled by a Republican majority that is in as much denial as the president himself. And so while we have these conversations, we have to consider what will be the implications according to one of two outcomes on January the 5th. Either you have a 50-50 tie potentially that leads to a tie-breaking vote from the incoming administration's party, or you have a majority that is still in keeping with what we've seen for the last 4 years. You would have divided government, but you would actually have the potential for at least another 2 years of gridlock. And how do we navigate around that potentiality? And how do we try to avoid it as best we can over these next several days? It's an important discussion, and I'm grateful to have this time with these passionate advocates and leaders in their own right to help us to understand the framing and to come away with some idea of where we can get in, where we fit in, to make sure that our interests are advanced.
So as we look at the challenges that Dr. Yeary has just laid out before us, we have a number of panelists from diverse backgrounds in many ways, but we're all similar in terms of the activism that expressed. We have Attorney Barbara Arnwine, who is the head of the Transformative Justice, she was formerly with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under the law. But in the transformative justice, she has really begun to lay a framework for transforming how we approach policy changes within the criminal justice era, the voting rights era in particular, really assembling a body of leaders across generational lines and even across ideological lines in many ways, have come together to look at how do we approach the protections that we needed for this election season and then shaping the policies going forth. And so I wanted Attorney Barbara Arnwine to share with us what she saw during the election season and what she sees now as we look at the next 72 days leading up to, well, it's 60 something days leading up to January 5th, and then the 72 days leading up to January 20th, the transfer of power.
Well, thank you so much, Reverend Wilson. And thank you, Reverend Yeary, and thank you to all the other panelists. It's a pleasure to be talking with everyone today. There's a lot to talk about, but let's just go back. You know, we predicted at the beginning of 2020 that this would be an election season characterized by massive voter suppression. We, of course, had to revise that in March to say that we're going to have to look at a season of massive virus voter suppression, because all of a sudden people were using the virus, the pandemic, as a way of also suppressing voters, mandating that if they wanted an absentee ballot, that they had to show that they actually had a physical illness that was certified by a doctor, that the mere fear of the fact that you had comorbidities and might be therefore more subjected to getting ill from the virus wasn't enough. So Texas went to court over and over and over to make sure that voters could not access the absentee ballot process unless they were over 65 and unless they already had some kind of certified major life-crippling illness. So we saw that nonsense. We also saw the real impact of what we had warned about the 2,000 less polling places throughout, the country, especially most of those 1,600 less in the 8 southern states. And we predicted that this would mean, as it did mean, massive long lines, especially for African Americans, for Latinos, for Native Americans. We predicted that these would be the consequences of those polling sites. And we saw it. We saw people standing in line for 16 hours. We saw people standing in line for 8 hours. We saw outrageous, failure to protect voters, to provide for voters. We saw states so desperate to suppress the vote that they only had 1 drop box. First of all, they fought to have none in some states, and they succeeded, by the way, in having no drop boxes. People don't understand that in South Carolina, there wasn't a single drop box. They don't understand that in Alabama, there were no drop boxes. They don't know that because that's not commonly known. And then you had states like Texas and others who fought to make sure that in Ohio, there was only 1 drop box, 1 for an entire county that had millions of voters, 1 drop box. Can you imagine? And then they took people to court because they got creative and said, okay, why don't we have some drive-up voting and let people, vote by driving up and doing what we call, a form of curbside voting, which is something I've been advocating since the whole pandemic broke out. I said it's the most effective way to vote in this kind of a situation. And they took them to court and tried to invalidate 150,000 ballots and lost, of course. But they won some ugly cases where they were requiring people to have witnesses for their ballots in a COVID era. How are you going to get a witness to come out and witness your ballot? How do you get to a notary when you are being told not to come outside at all because you are so sick? You got diabetes, you got high blood pressure, you got all these other issues. All of these things we saw. There's so much more I could go through because the voter suppression was widespread. It wasn't just one state. You know, people always are talking about who's the ground zero. The problem in this era is that there were too many. There were too many states that were suppressing the vote, and where we had to fight. Now, the good news is that we fought. The good news is that we said to voters that the number one thing they needed to know was to vote early. No matter what you did, no matter how you voted, vote early. Don't get caught in the trap of turning in your votes and putting on postmarked, in the mail late. We went through that. We really taught people how to use an absentee ballot. We taught people how to use drop boxes, something they'd never seen in their lives. We taught people how to do these things and how not to get caught up in the USPS trap. And we succeeded. Look at the number of early voters, over 100 million early voters. We've never seen anything like that in the history of this country. Look at the people, the very few ballots that were cast after November 3rd. Look at how well that was done. And that was because we got out there and what did we do? We marched with the John Lewis banners all over the country. We did those John Lewis marches. What did we do? We had Twitter storms, we had teletown halls, we had teach-ins, we did everything we could. We had churches and their online presence to do things. We brought people to the polls. We had clergy at the polls. We had lawyers at the polls. We had, monitors and people helping voters at the polls to make sure that they stayed in line, that they had chairs, that they were rested, that they had PPE, because voters needed masks. They needed help. And the voters responded. Because one thing I always say, if you tell voters that you value them, that they're important, that their vote is meaningful, they'll respond. But if you act like they don't count, if you mistreat them, if you abuse them, I saw a whole lot of voter abuse being done by these states, then voters don't respond. But they responded to us because we were saying, please vote. How desperately we needed them to vote, how they had to overcome these circumstances, and they did. So I am grateful to every single person on this panel, to all the millions of voters, the 150 plus million people who voted, to all, oh my goodness, to the young people. Look at the records that young voters set. My God, young voters of color, 73% turnout. Who ever heard of such a thing?
I want people to know this victory that we are witnessing was hard fought, but it was the people that made a difference. And Andrew Kang, we don't hear a lot in our community about what Asian American Bar Association is doing and has been doing, and some of the challenges that you saw in this election. I think it's important that you share with us what happened during this election season, what you all were doing, and how we have been in partnership with the combined bar associations as well.
Yeah, well, the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association just had its annual conference last week virtually. I think I'm going to wear my hat as Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Just Chicago for the purpose of this conversation, so I don't get in trouble. I think we saw two stories that one is very hopeful that Barbara talked to about record turnout from young people, people of color coming out in droves and voting, whether it was the Latino vote in the Southwest being what I think, once the data is fully out, decisive. And then in the Midwest, that so-called blue wall really being dependent on a Black turnout in metro areas at record numbers as well, right? And then, of course, Georgia, which I know we'll come back to. The story has not been finished yet about what happens next year. Will be, I think, in large part dependent on what happens with those two Senate races. This December, I believe January 5th is the date, but early voting starts on December 14th, which is unbelievable to have an election in December, but I can't imagine what that would be like in Chicago. But I think for the Asian American community, one thing we've seen from surveys that our DC affiliate has done in September, and then some exit polling data that has been available, is overwhelmingly Asian Americans, and this includes somewhat across the political spectrum, voted for Biden. And there's a lot of reasons that underlie that, but since COVID has hit, if there has been a silver lining to this terrible year, it is that a lot of Asian Americans are feeling more directly being targeted, being discriminated against. Maybe they've experienced that in the past on a low level basis, but certainly not seeing the President of the United States actively fomenting resentment and scapegoating, your community. And I think that was very troubling and jarring for many people. And I hope, and some polling does seem to suggest this, identifying because of that experience in real time alongside the Black Lives Matter movement and what has happened since George Floyd this year. If they hadn't, the previous terrible incidents of police murder in the past few years, if that didn't get their attention, that happening this year in conjunction with being scapegoated themselves, I think has created new opportunities, right, for folks that maybe didn't have that racial analysis in the past. And I'll just close by saying, I will love to get to Georgia because people may not know this about Georgia, but it has one of the fastest growing immigrant communities, and the Asian American community is a huge part of that. And the numbers are very promising as far as folks embracing not just progressive ideas and policies, but voting in solidarity, I think, with other communities of color. And so I am very hopeful about that. I will just say on the downside, over 70-something million people still voted for President Trump and embraced that, that MAGA movement, if you will, that white power movement, right? And he found new voters that resonated with. So I think, your viewers and the folks here on this panel, this is not a surprise to us that this is this large of a problem, but I think it is eye-opening for a good chunks of America that maybe thought, I love President-elect Biden's saying that we're better than this, but I think that remains to be seen whether we're better than this, right? We're slightly better than this by 5 million votes, but let's just be very real about where we are as a country right now.